get started our class with a question. Why it should be English? There is no doubt that English has become a common language for the global society. Is there any reason? So how can we justify its position as a global language? So in this regard, if you would try to find the answer, there are several approaches we need to take. But in this case, that I'd like to start with the history context. In other words, let's put English on a history context. So it means that let's trace the movement of English around the world. But before we are doing this, the first thing is we must start with its local origin. In other words, how does it start and how it was started as a local language. So, as we are doing this, that first of all, that I'd like to show a forest picture about how English started its movement around the world. So let's get started here. England. As you know, this is British Island. Here, the first word we must remember then who was its first inhabitant, who was the first settlers in British Island. Then we must think about the cat. So this is the question, when did they arrive at the island? So the historians, they usually estimate it could be around BC. So we may have a question, Celts. So Celtic people, do they leave any traces in English language? Yes, of course. They left their traces in English language. For example, there is many names for river or some regions that we can trace back its Celtic origin. And also, it's even more curious to find that some words that sounds very modern, but in fact, that they can trace back to Celtic origin. Let's take an example. The slogan. And also the chorus. So the slogan sounds like a modern language, but its trace, it came from the Celtic language. And how about the chorus? It sounds like a car. So this is one example. Then the car is usually often word by British English, but in America they often use the automobile. This is an interesting case that British English is sometimes apart from American English. This is one example that we will later elaborate. Anyway, so let's think about the Celt. So it all starts with this Celt English. Then the English is nowadays, today's English, the result of dynamics. It is also was an importer of foreign languages, and also it has been the exporter to the world, to the global society. So let's take an example. Who was the first importer? That was Latin. So it's interesting to find that Roman, the British was under Roman sovereignty for 400 years. So it all started in AD 43. So the Roman Emperor Claudius, they landed at the British island. How many soldiers did he bring? 40,000 Roman soldiers. So you can see how big the troop was. At that time, you can imagine that how small the Celtic population was. But Roman Emperor, they brought 40,000 soldiers, and they immediately seized the British island. So you can imagine they brought with the Latin language. So you can imagine that there is Latin words, there is Latin traces left in English languages. There are many Latin traces. For example, Winchester, Wales, and there are many Latin traces. So then, who was the second? So it was around 400 years AD. There were some Northern European tribes. They began to arrive at the British island on a sporadic basis. I mean that they came as sometimes soldiers for Roman legions, and these tribes are very aggressive, and they are very war-fighting people, and they are very brave people, and they came from Northern European countries, and they finally controlled the whole British island except the northern part of Scotland, and they get started the origin of English. Who are they? Guess who are they? They are Anglo-Saxon. So, actually, Anglo-Saxon, they are not the people. They were not big enough to make a people. They were tribes. So there were 3 tribes, Anglo-Saxon and Jute. And when they first arrived in Britain Island, they couldn't communicate each other because their dialects are so different. But as they speak, as they communicate each other, it's curiously that emerged a very common language emerged from these 3 different Germanic tribes. That was the birth of English. So it was around 400 years. It was around 400 years. That's why we are talking about 1,500 year history of English. So please remember, it's all about Anglo-Saxon people who happened to arrive at the island. Then we have another question: why? Why the Northern Europeans, they arrived at British people? Why? What happened to Roman soldiers? What happened to Roman Empire? So what happened there? The Romans, they couldn't stay there. They had to withdraw. Why? Because their home country in Rome, they were in trouble. So they had to leave. They had to leave England, and they came back to their homeland in Rome to protect their homeland. So there was a vacuum. There were actually the Roman emperor, the Roman soldiers, they maintained a peaceful coexistence with the Celtic people. So after the Roman soldiers were gone, actually the Celtic people was in trouble. Why? Because they had no longer protection from the Roman soldiers. So there were very savage tribes in the northern part of Britain. They began to plunder the Celtic people. So the Celtic people, they needed help. So they asked some people, some Northern European people, please come over here and help us. Help protect us from the northern savage people. So here comes the Germanic people, the Anglo-Saxon people. So in many cases, the Anglo-Saxon were invited by the Celtic people to come over here, to come to the British island and help them. So they were invited. Of course, there are other Anglo-Saxon people, they just volunteered to come here as a soldier, as a hired soldier. So they worked for the Roman Empire. So anyway, in many cases, they were invited. However, ironically, they were invited to help the Celtic, but later, they became the conqueror. They conquered the Celtic people. So they become inhabitant. It was the next inhabitant. Anglo-Saxon people become inhabitant of the British people. So it's curious to find here. So this is why the origin of WASP. WASP, have you heard about WASP? WASP is heard of White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So WASP, who is the WASP? That is after 16th, after a long time later, the WASP become the only colonists in America. So it's interesting to find the WASP word that came from the Anglo-Saxon people. So anyway, so they are the second. So this is the second import from people, the Anglo-Saxon. They gave the English language to Britain Island. So let's move on. Who is the next visitor? It was not welcome. The British people did not welcome them because they continued to harass them. They plundered the monasteries in the island. Who are they? They are Vikings. So when it comes to Vikings, that there are several other words that also refer to Vikings. Danish, Old Norse, Scandinavian, so in general, these are referring to the same group of people. The Viking, they're very aggressive, and they are but seafaring people, and they began to attack. They began to trouble the British people, the Viking people. So here is a hero, British hero, that yes, who he is. He is a British hero. That without him, that maybe the Old Norse could have become a global language for the global society today. Who was he? So he was brave enough to subdue the Viking invasion. So he made a peaceful treaty with the Viking people so he could stop the spread of Old Norse in the British Island. And he is the most respected person when it comes to English because he protected English language from Old Norse. What is the Old Norse? This is the language of the Scandinavian Viking people. Who was he? He was the great king, the great King Alfred. So you can imagine how important, how significant his contribution was to the protection of English. Why? Because he is the only king who has subtitle as the Great. So why? Because without him, then English, the English that was born by the Anglo-Saxon people, could have no way of survive the Viking invasion. So that's why the British people, they respect the great King Alfred as a protector of English at the time. So this is interesting. So these are the Roman came over here. The Anglo-Saxon was invited into Britain, but later they turned to be the conqueror. And also there is a Viking, and the Viking, they continue to at first they were savage, but later they had a peaceful coexistence with the British people because many Danish people, they married the British woman and they settled down in British. So I would say that was peaceful coexistence, but it ended in 1066. So what happened? This is a milestone for English English literature that ended the Viking time in British Ireland. That was, and also they marks the start of Middle English. So this is a very significant number. The start year of Middle English. So let's remember, 1066, that is the start year of Middle English. And let's get back to the Old English is here. The Old English is usually the before this one. So you usually say the Old English. I will specify later in later classes what is the Old English is here. So the Old English is, I can say, Anglo-Saxon English. Anglo-Saxon tribes, the English is here. So we will elaborate later, but the Old English, then it has the and the Old Anglo-Saxon, the invader. Then this is Anglo-Saxon English is here, and there is some mysteries here. So many linguists find it very strange. Why? Because the Anglo-Saxon people here arrived and there was a Celtic culture. As we can imagine, the Celtic people must have a very high level of civilization. Why? Because they were under the Roman sovereignty, and they brought the Latin language. So they taught how to read and how to write the Latin language to the Celtic people. So we can imagine they must have a very high level of education. So the Celtic people and the Anglo-Saxon people, let's compare. So at that time, the Anglo-Saxon people was not, maybe they were considered as a kind of end of civilization. That was not so civilized, and they were very good at fighting. So it's strange, it's a mystery. Why the Anglo-Saxon, their tribes' language, they overwhelmed their Celtic language. This is a mystery. Among the linguistics, so why the Celtic language, they had disappeared. So even though they have been long settled there, and Anglo-Saxon is a newcomer, then how their language can replace the Celtic language as a mainstream language? Of course, Celtic language did not totally disappear. Its traces still remain. For example, the Welsh people, the 20% of Welsh people, they can still speak. They can still speak Welsh language. Welsh is a branch of Celtic language. But I mean on the mainstream language for the British people. So it's strange. What's the reason? Why Celtic lost its status as a mainstream language for the British Island? Why the Anglo-Saxon at the time, they are under-civilized people, and even they were considered even savage people. If you consider the civilized people of Celtic, then why and how? It happens to be that the Anglo-Saxon, their language could overpower the language of Celtic. This is a mystery for many linguists. So, this is the question. And also, how about the Viking people? This is the Dutch people, so they have their own languages here. So, let's find and also Old Norse, of course, they left their traces in English language. For example, the Old Norse started skull. came from the Scandinavian. These are the traces of then old Norse language that is left in English. So we have a question. So what happened in here? So what happened in 1066? So it ended the peaceful coexistence between Anglo-Saxon and Viking people. So this is the year that another ambitious Frenchman, he came over to Britain, and he came from the France and northern France. Then he brought with him about 5,000 or 10,000 soldiers. His name is William. William came over to Britain, and they took control of the Britain, and he became the king of Britain. So here there is an interesting number. You see, the William at the time we would say Norman conquest. They call the Norman conquest. Norman conquest in 1066. So what is Norman conquest? He came from the northern French, the northern France. He came from northern France. Then he had a lot of fortunes and assets in France. Then he came and he brought 5,000 or 10,000 soldiers, and he attacked the Britain, and he took control of it, and he became became the king of the Britain. Here, this is an interesting number. How many soldiers he did bring with him? Then, I have a question. How many? What was the population of Britain, Anglo-Saxon? At that time, that was about 1.5 million. So, why is it interesting? Because it came down over there with the 5. So it's very interesting to find that the William have only 5,000 soldiers, and he can take control of the Britain, whose population is as large as 1.5 million. This is interesting. Why? So let's get back to Claudius. So Claudius is Roman emperor. Then it was around AD 43. So it was actually 10 centuries later. Then he came over a much smaller number of Claudius. Claudius came over here 400,000. 400,000. Oh, no, I got it wrong. 40,000. So it was only AD 43. The Roman emperor, he came to the Britain Island with 40,000, but 10 centuries later, the conqueror, William, came over with only 5,000, but he could still conquer the Britain. So it's interesting. So anyway, why I'm emphasizing it? Because it has something to do with the fate of English and French. So let me start. So that means Britain was under the Britain came the Norman conquest. So what does it mean? What is the change? Because of in the Britain society, the French speaking people became the ruler. So French people replaced English speaking English judge in the court, and French speaking people replaced English speaking senior officials in the government. So the French, at that time, if you speak French language, that means something about your social status. So in other words, the upper class people, they were speaking French. So the low class life people, they were speaking English. In church, they were speaking English. So you can imagine, the language was division of social class. The language was a sign of social class. Let's take an example. At the time, Britain, please remember, Britain was ruled by the French people. So you can imagine the language could be a sign of a social division. Let's take an example. So if the English name was given to the animal, if the animal is alive, so animal is wandering in the forest. For example, this is sheep and cow and swine. So these are the English words. English name was given to sheep, cow, and swine when they were wandering in the forest. They arrived. Maybe you can imagine the English people, they are the low-class people, so they have to go around. They have to working on the field, on the forest. So English name was given to these animals. Some people say. I don't know whether it's true or not. Anyway, this is interesting. Interesting thought. However, once they were killed and they were cooked and they were served at the table for the people who is the ruler, who is the upper class people and nobility, then the French name was given to these animals. For example, the mouton, here is mouton, beef, and pork. This is French. So this is one example that the language reflects the cultural and the social division. So anyway, let's move on to this one. Then, so here is another thing. There is this very interesting thing. So at first, the French was the mainstream language. It was the language of those who have the power, and the English was the language of the very poor people and the grassroots people. But what happens in 200 years later? From English the power of two languages began to reverse. In other words, the French language began to gain lost its power, and there are less and less people using the French language in public setting, and also there is less and less French language that is educated at school. Instead, there are more and more people who are speaking English even at school, and even the English king, they were speaking English in the public setting. So what happened there? So this is a strange reversal in the fate of English language and French language. Actually, the French was declining, English was rising, and English was becoming the mainstream language of Britain Island. What happened there? What's the reason? So this is a contrast. This is the opposite case of this Celtic. The Anglo-Saxons, the language, they overpowered the Celtic because the invader's language, they become the mainstream language of Britain. But in this case, it's the opposite. The invaders' language, they lost the power. The Anglo-Saxons' English, they remain in power. They regained their power. So this is quite a different situation, opposite situation. So what's the reason? What's the reason for English language to regain its momentum? Why? So linguists, they explain the reason. First of all, the first reason, the French, the leaders, they lost their fortune in France. In other words, at that time, the French leaders, the Norman leaders who was high officials and were king in Britain, they had a double life. So in other words, they have a mansion and they have a palace. They are living pension in Britain. However, they have a lot of fortune in France, in Normandy. So they have a double life. So they used to spend half of the year in Britain, and they used to spend another half of the year in France. So they have a double life. But finally, the day came that ended it. What was it? And they lost. The French leaders, the Norman leaders, they lost all the fortunes in France. Maybe in French, in somewhere in French, they seized it, and they lost all the fortunes in France. So as a result, the Norman upper class, the rulers, they weakened their power in Britain. That could be the first reason. So there must be another reason. So this is a social phenomenon. The Frenchmen, they moved to Britain, and they need to make a family. So many French young men, they had the British women as their wives. So they had a family, they have a children. Then the children, we grew up with the bilingual. They are speaking English with mother, and they are speaking French with the father. And also they grew up as a bilingual. So this is the way the English begin to gain as a bilingual language. But there is most important factor. The major reason that the language of Norman, the French language, couldn't become the mainstream language of Britain. There is another reason. So let's imagine if the Norman, the French language, has successfully become a mainstream language of Britain, then maybe you should be speaking French as a global language. So what happened there? Maybe one of the biggest reason for the failure of the French language to settle as a mainstream language in Britain was its number. So the number of French speaking people was numerically so weak. So it couldn't reach a critical mass. Why? Because the number of French-speaking people was so small that it couldn't overwhelm the English language. So what's the example? That as I emphasized, this is the number, is here. They brought only 5,000 soldiers here, but there was already 1.5 million British people, so numerically weak. The French-speaking people was too weak, too small. So this is a lesson that, that's why the people say this was a Norman conquest of Britain, but there was no linguistic conquest of Britain. So why I'm talking, I think this is very intriguing, because the power of a language comes from, also it has something to do with the number of its speakers here. So if the French, the Norman conquest was made with for much bigger number, for like 1 million or 500,000 people, young soldiers, if French, William, they came over to Britain with 500,000 French soldiers, maybe then by now we could study very hard. We could be studying French language as a world common language. So this is something that we find this very interesting. So this is important. So English has imported from the foreign languages here. So the French language also has left many traces in English. So let's think about then. So it was about. We have a question. What's the impact of French language in English? Because they have long, the French language have left many traces in English. The first influence is English has become more lexically rich. In other words, English has many verbs that came from the French language. They say about 10,000 verbs that came from the French language. And also the French and also the English has new words from French like amber. Amber is 호박 is a kind of gem, and also orange and saffron. So there are hundreds of words that came from French language. So we can say language is like a living organism that is in contact. It keeps growing by adopting a new words from foreign languages. Here, this is an example. English language, they have Latin, and also they have some Anglo-Saxon. English was born by these tribes, and also they have Viking, was a Danish traces left in English, and also there's a French language, and they left the traces in English language, and one of the results is a verb. English verb was very simplified, and also there is a lot more words that added into English. So this shows that what really makes English very strongly based as the global language is the constant contact with the foreign language and foreign people. So it has constant contact with the Latin language, French language, and Old Norse, and it has imported languages. But now, so it's very interesting that English still remains a local language. So you might be curious then when English began its global spread around the world. So this is what we are going to discuss in the next class.